But last week we kicked things off with a first rule of engagement, a first biblical principle that can lead us to stronger relationships, healthier relationships. And that first rule, that first principle was this: be fully present. Not caught up in a preferred future. Gosh, if I just set this relationship aside, maybe there's something better out there for me. Not caught up in the past. Well, gosh, because of what I've experienced before, couldn't trust that guy or gal, so can't trust this one, Just fully present in this moment, not letting the busyness of the world get in the way of any relationship. Just being fully present brings health and strength. Having focused there last week, I do encourage you to listen in if you missed it. Today we turn to a second rule of engagement, biblical principle that leads us to strong relationships. And as I share this one, it may take a little time to sink in, so know that we're going to spend some time going deeper into this. Second rule of engagement is simply this: submit. To be willing to submit to others. Now, a bit of a loaded word, and so let me drift through some ways to define what we mean by that today. We're using this word today in the sense of to lower, submit, to lower our own estimation of self when it gets too inflated, so that we might pay attention to the other, maybe even prioritize the needs of the other person in that relationship. Or we're using this word today in the sense of to yield. Again, to yield our wants to the needs of others. Not just yielding to God's relationship, but yielding to others. Or maybe the best way to think of this today, even beyond to lower, to yield, the best way to describe this idea of submission as we talk about it today is to say it's simply the willingness to do this, to serve others. Now, to get into this today, we want to take a look at the very best example we have of this kind of yielding and lowering and serving. And the best example we have of this, no surprise to you, the best example we have of this second rule of engagement, this kind of relating, comes back to Jesus and how he consistently related to others. And so looking at his example today, we want to pull a couple things out of that because they are things that undergird, that drive this second principle. And so first today, we want to pull this out of Jesus' example to us. He came to submit. That's why God sent him. It's why he walked this earth, to submit to others, to yield himself not just to God, but to others. And if that was his mission, if that was his priority, if that was primarily what he modeled for us in his life and in his relationships, then what does that mean? Got to be our mission as well, right? That's got to be how we relate to others as well. So that's the first thing we want to take on today. But then we've also got to come to terms with this today and really hear this, acknowledge this. So important. To submit in relationship takes more than just a want to. It takes more than just, okay, God, I'm not doing this well. I got to try harder. To do this and do this well, if we really mean we want to do this well, requires a total transformation of one's mind, of how we look at our relationships. The only way we can live into this as Jesus did is to constantly say, God, keep transforming how I look at my relationships, how I look at others, so that how I look at those things doesn't look anything like how the world, how the culture around me looks at those things. And so those being the two things that we want to take a look at today. Here's the first, again. Christ came to serve. He came to submit. In fact, what was that for him? That was his mission, his sole purpose. In Mark chapter 10, we find Jesus teaching his disciples a lot about that very mission. And in fact, here he takes this mission of serving to the ultimate level when he tells them eventually this very mission is going to lead him to do what? To suffer, to die, right? And I think we'd all agree the disciples respond to him saying that pretty much how we would have. They try not to listen. They push it aside. They don't like hearing that. Sounds crazy, right? Doesn't fit with their model of who this Lord and Savior is supposed to be. But having ignored what he said, here's the result. In the end, they end up in the midst of this fighting over not who among them would be willing to serve in this way. They end up not arguing over who in the end would be willing to suffer and die for the cause. I mean, that might have been a good discussion. Instead, because they don't listen to this mission at all as it's kind of offered to them, what do they end up doing? They end up arguing about who will be the greatest disciple, who will be on top in the end, Crazy. That's crazy in light of what Jesus brings to them. In fact, in Mark 10:35, James and John especially show us they haven't listened to their teacher at all because they're asking him for positions of power in his new kingdom, right? Which of course irritates the heck out of the rest of the disciples. And so in the midst of all of that, Jesus calls them together and he says this to them. Here's verse 42 and following. Give a listen. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles," and all he's saying here is, this is how the world looks at things. This is how your culture looks at things. You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Their high officials exercise authority over them. And it's important to pause just for a moment to acknowledge that that wasn't just then, that is now. We're all at times, this is just sort of the natural way we as human beings interact. We're all at times looking for some kind of pecking order in our relationships without even realizing it. And so sensing that certainly is happening with his disciples, here's where Jesus goes with this teaching. Verse 43, "Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first among you must be servant, must be slave of all." And then verse 45 really talks about his mission. "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." Now, what does this passage clearly tell us? And I'm going to say this a few times. I hope the redundancy isn't irritating, but just helpful. What does this passage so clearly tell us? What should have this teaching of Jesus said to his disciples? Very clearly. That Jesus' reason for being is to submit to the needs of others. And again, if that's his primary teaching, if that's the primary model he offers us in terms of his relating to others, if serving others is such a key part of his mission, then that tells us this: got to be a part of our mission as well. If this teaching from Mark makes that very clear, it always helps to have a physical example. And so we find that to add to the teaching. We find that in the Gospel of John now, chapter 13. It says in John 13 that one night the disciples gather, and as they gather, as they come together, and this isn't something that we need today, but it was something they needed back then. As they gather at their destination, they need to have their feet washed. They do. And who knows that needs to be done? All of them. Have you ever stopped to think about that? Every single disciple, not just Jesus, knew that their feet needed to be washed. And yet, what did the disciples also think they knew? That this was a lowly servant's task beneath them. So they gather, they have a meal together, and then we have this in verse 5. After that, after the meal, Jesus poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Could there be a more significant model of serving than that? And then to drive his point home, we have this in verse 13. You call me teacher, you call me Lord, and rightly so. That's what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should do what? You also should wash one another's feet. And certainly he meant beyond that. You should wash the feet of others. Thinking of that symbolism. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. And then even when we jump forward to verses 34 and 35, Jesus takes things even deeper there when he says this, a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, all will know that you are my disciples. And now here's that influence because of how we love. By this, all will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. And when you connect those last words to what has just transpired, all of a sudden you see that connection, the connection between love and submit, the connection between love and serve. Clearly, if you and I are going to call ourselves disciples, then we're going to have to, at times, seek to be foot washers, right? Thinking of that symbolism. Or, in other words, if you and I are going to be disciples, we've got to find ways daily, to seek out ways daily to serve others. And to want to do that, why? Because in the midst of the best example Jesus could ever give us, he not only gives us that example, but then he says, you do as I have done, right? With this first thought before us today, this understanding that Jesus' mission was to serve others, and that's got to be our mission if our relationships are going to be healthy, strong, God-honoring. With that thought before us, I want you to begin to ask yourself first, what are the needs of those around you? And guys, as much as caring for the hungry, as much as finding ways to use biblical language, clothing the naked, as important as it is to see those physical needs around us, my goodness, in our relationships, whole lot of other needs. It's just as significant when God draws us into a relationship with someone who hasn't had good relationships. They are insecure. They struggle to like themselves. Man, when you begin to think, oh yeah, those are needs they have. What does it mean for me to be in their life in a way that helps them meet the need for affirmation? Not, oh, you're great, but the affirmation that's grounded in God's love and grace, right? So when you think about the needs of those around you, consider all kinds of different needs that people have, those God has given you. But first, I want you to think about what are the needs of those around you. And then as those come to mind, as they become clear in your mind, then simply ask this, are you willing to serve those you're in relationship with in ways that help to meet those needs? And are you willing to do that, not because Pastor says so, are you willing to do that not even because the Bible tells me so? Are you willing to do that because Jesus himself continues to speak into your ear daily saying what? Do as I did. Do as I did. When it comes to your spouse, what do they need? You know? Deep questions. When it comes to your children, what do they need? When it comes to your parents, what do they need? You know, pause and think about that this week. And then as those things come to mind, when it comes to your neighbor, your coworker, when it comes to those around you, what do they need? And then ask as well, are you willing to submit yourself to that relationship, that person in ways that help to meet those needs? Pretty clear example, wouldn't you say? Pretty clear teaching from Jesus. And yet, here's the challenge. Even though we get it, it's still so hard to do this. And thus, we have this second core thought today. Secondly, if we're going to be able to do this as consistently as possible, secondly, if we're going to be able to do this, then we've got to let God in Christ truly, completely transform our minds so that we no longer see things as the world sees things. We no longer see relationships with the attitude of what's in it for me. We begin to see the mind of Christ in us. We now begin to see relationships. We begin to see others as Jesus saw those, not as the world around us sees those things. The captain of a ship looked into the dark night and saw some faint lights in the distance. Immediately, he told his signalman to send a message, alter your course 10 degrees south. Promptly, a return message was received, alter your course 10 degrees north. The captain was angry. His command had been ignored. So he sent a second message, alter your course 10 degrees south. I am a captain. Soon another message was received, alter your course 10 degrees north. I am a third-class seaman. Immediately the captain, now very upset, sent a third message, knowing the fear it would evoke. Alter your course 10 degrees south. I'm a battleship. The message that came back was this, alter your course 10 degrees north. I am a lighthouse. When we get to being very demanding in our relationships, we bring a self-focus in our relating to others. We bring the kind of attitude that causes us to begin to lose sight of this very clear teaching, this very clear example, serve the needs of others. When we find ourselves in that place in our relationships, we often need a big old lighthouse to kind of wake us up and steer us in another direction. Today, what we're calling that lighthouse is this: a transformed mind. Because when we have the mind of Christ in us, and that leads us to strive to relate to others as Jesus did. No longer do we get caught up in primarily what's in it for me. No longer do we even get caught up in, I got to work harder at this. I don't want to serve this person, but I know I have to. When the mind of Christ is embedded in us, I hope you get it now. What's going to be flowing through your mind? I want to do for this person what he did for me. Changes everything. Paul writes in Romans 12, great passage about transformation. Paul writes, Romans 12, verse 2 and following, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And again, what's the pattern of this world? Often submit to no one. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. For by the grace God has given to us, I say to every one of you, Paul writes, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought. And then here's Paul saying something similar to the church in Philippi. He writes to them, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. Your attitude should be the same as that of Jesus Christ. And what was his attitude, at least as we might define it in that one moment? I'm going to wash some feet so that I might ask my followers to do the same. Rules of engagement. Rule 1, be fully present, not caught up in past regrets, not caught up in unrealistic expectations about the future, not distracted by the busyness of life, but fully present to those in our lives in each moment. But now rule 2, simply this: submit. Take these questions with you today as you strive to embrace this second biblical principle, to submit, to serve, first, again, what are the needs of those around you? And then secondly, are you willing, like Jesus, to prioritize caring for those needs so that your relationships might be what God would have them be? Places where you certainly can serve others. Let's pray.